Hey everybody, it's Jason Blah here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why you should be wearing wrist wraps for all of your pressing. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and a lot of times newer lifters don't understand this. They'll see knee wraps and things, and they'll see me say that, hey, you're against knee wraps, so why do you wear wrist wraps? And it's because they're used for completely, and I mean completely different purposes. When you look at the joints involved, what you're trying to do with your wrist, you notice you keep them stationary, right? You don't bend your wrist as part of the movement of a bench press, right? Your hands stay fairly stationary. It's not one of the joints that move. Your shoulder joint and your elbow joint move, right? But your wrist joint doesn't move during the bench press. So that should be the first giveaway that something different is going on. So when you look at things like knee wraps, when you look at a squat with knee wraps on, what's happening? Well, the knee bends. The knee goes through almost its entire range of motion, and if you squat ass to grass, it does go through its full range of motion on a squat. Well, when you wrap up your knees, it's not actually done for injury prevention. In fact, there's been multiple studies that have come out now that show that knee wraps actually over time damage your knee joint. Right? Especially for heavy lifters. They damage your knee joint. So when you see guys who are doing them for silly things like leg presses and hack squats and all this other stuff, that's absolutely ludicrous because they're actually destroying their own knees over time. And a lot of times they'll say stuff like, oh, it seems to protect them. No, it's just so they can add an extra plate for each side. Right? And people will say, well, if you can lift more weight, isn't that giving you better stimulation? Well, if your muscles are lifting more weight, but if the wraps are lifting more weight, no. Now, that's where we get into the interesting point. People say, what do you mean the wraps are lifting the weight? Wraps can't lift anything. Sure they can. When you wrap your knees up, you're wrapping a bunch of nylon around a joint. Well, when you bend that joint, what happens? The back of the knee compresses, right? It's going to compress whatever's wrapped around the back. And it's not like you're just running one layer. You're running multiple layers of this stuff. So it balls up and creates, when your leg compresses, it creates a ball, a little ball behind your knee. Well, that pushes you upward. And that's not your muscles doing it. It's stored energy on your eccentric rep, storing into that piece of material behind your knee. And then it helps drive you upward out of the bottom through external force, not your muscles actually contracting. And you need to understand the difference. There are things that help you lift because they either create more stability or because they create more neuromuscular efficiency. And neuromuscular efficiency always means your muscles are doing more because they're firing harder. Or they apply external resistance to your body to help move a weight. So think of it as like an exoskeleton. Just like you think of the big squat and bench press suits that people wear. That's like an exoskeleton that helps you lift more weight, right? Well, a knee wrap is actually usually part of a squat suit combination. But it's like an exoskeleton wrapped around you that helps you lift more weight from the outside. So it doesn't have more stimulating effect on your quads and glutes and things like that. And in fact, knee wraps cause more injuries than anything else. But for competitive lifting, there are knee wraps divisions where you're allowed to wear them. And so you should wear them. And there are guys who legitimately get 80 to 100 pounds out of their knee wraps. And that can be based upon the fact that you can look at guys who hold the records in both classes. And sometimes they're up to 100 pounds apart if the same guy has set both records, right? So it can be a lot in some cases. I'm not saying most people are going to get that out of them, but a few guys clearly do. So we're dealing with something different. So why are we wrapping our wrists? For stability. We are wrapping our wrists for better stability in our wrists. Because we're holding the wrist more stable, they become less of a fragile, weak link in your pressing. We could argue that it helps you lift more weight, but there's other reasons to do it. Now, if your wrists are more stable and it lets you get a better grip on the bar, and we have less instability from that, and it helps you lift a little more weight, okay, that's a good thing from a strength perspective. It's also a good thing from a muscle stimulation perspective, but it's really minimal. It's really minimal. Usually it just helps reduce the pain on the heaviest lifts. It may not actually help you lift more weight. So we come over to the point of why. Well, that extra stability in the wrist creates less inflammation from training, right? Because what happens, you're wrapping the joint, it holds it more stable. It also gives it a little bit of external support. Well, your wrists are usually one of your weaker links in terms of overall inflammation as a result of your training. So if you're going to do really, really low volume training and you don't care if your wrists hurt a little bit, it's probably not a big deal, is it? But what happens when you want to put in any sort of real training volume? If your wrists are hurting and sore every time you go to bench press again, you're not going to be able to train as often. If you're getting additional soreness and fatigue that doesn't come from a training effect, what does that do to your recovery? Well, we know that there's a psychological aspect to recovery. Additional soreness that doesn't give you extra benefits always reduces recovery. In fact, additional soreness seems to slow recovery in general anyways, because you just don't feel good. It affects you psychologically. It affects different aspects of your life. So if your wrists are sore, there's a recovery component. But the other thing is, if your wrists take longer to recover from a heavy pressing session, you're not going to be able to do it as often. And you're not going to be able to use quite as much volume or as much weight because you're in continual discomfort. So when we're dealing with wrist wraps, we're dealing with something that makes it easier to recover in terms of a joint being inflamed. Now, a lot of people would say silly stuff like, oh, suck it up, sweetheart, but that's really a stupid ass way to train. Like literally, if you're going to take that approach and you're going to be, oh, I'll just be the tough guy and just suck up whatever extra pain when it's completely unnecessary pain. I mean, it's one thing if there are certain pains and aches and things that are associated as an essential part of your training, that they just are going to happen no matter what you do. That's what we should say, yeah, just suck it up. But when it's additional pain and discomfort that's going to discourage your training and your motivation and reduce your quality of life that has zero benefits, you're basically just being stupid at that point. So this falls into that category of basically just a recovery and restoration tool. That's really what it is. And because of that, it doesn't make sense to not use wrist wraps, right? It doesn't make sense to not use wrist wraps. Now, elbow wraps would be a different story, and obviously I don't advocate elbow wraps. I don't even advocate elbow sleeves, because for the most part, sleeves don't do anything really beneficial other than help you lift more weight. Right? They don't really. That's a myth that sleeves and things keep joints warmer and all this other nonsense. It just simply isn't true. But when we're dealing with the actual wrist, this is something you'll notice over time: is the amount of wrist soreness and wrist fatigue you get from pressing either with any sort of volume or any sort of heavy weight. It really, really tends to add up. It tends to add up a lot. Plus, the wrist straps help reinforce proper joint position. They help reinforce proper joint position. And again, if it helps keep your wrist in a better position, that's also going to be a big factor in reducing that inflammation, actually reducing chances of wrist strains, because wrist strains and things are very, very real. In fact, I had someone who years ago, he's a troll, but he used to claim that the way he watched me bench press, he imitated it, and it hurt him, and therefore I was a terrible source of information because he sees a little bit of wrist bend, but he doesn't understand that's just the shape of my particular hand, and the way that I bend actually allows the bar to sit directly above my wrist bone and in line with my elbow, forming a straight line. All right. I can't actually do, and I don't know many people who can make an actual fist while bench pressing. I can't physically do that. My hand isn't shaped that way. For me, the bar would actually just break my thumb and fall if I tried to do that with a heavy weight. So I do have a bit of wrist bend, but if you notice, it's like what's called a bulldog grip. So the bar is actually directly above my wrist. My hand isn't cocked back with the bar sitting into my hand. It's actually sitting above the wrist bone. That's the position I have to do with my hand to get it into that position. But this one clown who did it without wrist wraps, and he did it that way, and he strained his wrists, and he blamed me and claimed it was from watching the way that I bench press. And, so you get this sort of nonsense. But the reality is, once you get your hand position learned and then you wrap your wrist up, it helps lock you in. And again, it will just reduce overall fatigue on your wrist. It's going to cause you lower chances of wrist strains. It's going to reduce general discomfort, reduce inflammation, in a joint that could limit your total training frequency, training volume, and training intensity. So it just doesn't make sense not to use wrist wraps. They're inexpensive. And they're going to make life a lot easier for you when you're training hard. And I classify them as a piece of essential equipment. They're something that's probably one of the first things you should buy. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.